How America shocked Hitler's best. The tank war Germany thought it had already won. Fog sits heavy over eastern France. September 1944. A German Panther tank commander grips the cold steel of his hatch and peers into the gray morning. Somewhere out there, across fields still wet with dew, American Shermans are moving. He can hear them, the grinding of tracks, the cough of engines. He smiles. He has done this before. In Poland, in France, in Russia. He knows exactly what comes next. His 75mm gun can punch through a Sherman at 2,000 meters. The Americans cannot scratch his armor at half that range. The math is simple, the outcome inevitable. He has faced better armies than this one and buried them. He does not know that within hours, his entire brigade will be gone. He does not know that the army he has been trained to despise, the army of shopkeepers and factory workers, the soft nation across the Atlantic, has spent 18 months learning how to kill men exactly like him, learning it the hard way, in the dirt of Tunisia, in the hedgerows of Normandy, in the rubble of a dozen broken French towns. He does not know that what is coming for him is not a better tank. It is a system, a machine built not of steel and armor plate, but of coordination, adaptation, and a kind of ruthless industrial efficiency that no military in history had ever assembled at such scale. The Panther is the finest medium tank in the world. The men who will destroy it this morning know that. They have been dying to that fact for months. It does not save him. This is the story of how the United States Army went from catastrophe to conquest in 18 months. How it transformed a military embarrassment into the most lethal combined arms force on the planet. How ordinary Americans, farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Pittsburgh, a liquor salesman from New Jersey, defeated the warriors who had conquered Europe. And how a nation that had never wanted to fight a war became, almost against its will, devastatingly good at it. To understand the miracle, you first have to understand a disaster. February 1943. Tunisia. The United States Army had been in the war for 14 months, and it had not yet fought a serious battle against a first-rate European enemy on European-style terrain. That test was coming, and the Army was not ready. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel understood this. The Desert Fox had spent 3 years reading his enemies, learning their rhythms, finding the seams where confidence became complacency. He had beaten the British when they were at their best. He had pushed to the very gates of Cairo. Now he turned his attention to the Americans. His staff called them Britain's Italians, a comparison meant to wound, suggesting soldiers with wealth but without the will to fight. Rommel decided to teach them a lesson. On February 14, 1943, the Africa Corps struck through the Fade Pass. 2 panzer divisions knifed through the American lines like a blade through paper. What happened next was not merely a defeat. It was a collapse, a rout so complete and so humiliating that its full dimensions were hidden from the American public for months. The Second Corps attacked in parade ground formations, tanks rolling forward in neat V shapes, the way cavalry had charged a century before. They moved without infantry support, without artillery coordination, without reconnaissance. German anti-tank crews dug into ridgelines the Americans hadn't bothered to scout, waited until the Shermans were at point-blank range. The killing was systematic. In 5 days, the Second Corps was driven back more than 50 miles. 6,500 men killed, wounded, or captured. 183 tanks destroyed. 200 artillery pieces left in the sand. 500 trucks scattered across the desert like broken toys. Roughly 20% of the engaged force simply ceased to exist as a fighting unit. The commander, Major General Lloyd Fredendall, had built his headquarters in a ravine 70 miles behind the front lines. He communicated in a bizarre personal code that confused his own officers. He refused to visit the front. He had no accurate picture of what was happening to his men until it was already over. He was flown home, promoted, and given a training command in Tennessee where he could do no further harm. The pass was called Kasserine. For every soldier who survived it, that name would carry the weight of catastrophe for the rest of the war. Rommel drew his conclusions. So did every senior German commander who read the after-action reports. American industry could produce impressive quantities of equipment. American soldiers lacked the will and the training to use it effectively. The United States had wealth. It did not have warriors. This was not merely arrogance. It was a reasonable reading of the available evidence, and it would prove to be the most consequential miscalculation of the entire war. To understand why the Germans got it wrong, you have to understand what they believe they had gotten right. The Wehrmacht had spent 2 decades developing blitzkrieg, lightning war, a complete reimagining of how armies fought. Tanks, aircraft, infantry, and artillery were fused into a single integrated instrument of destruction, capable of acting faster than any enemy could respond. Find a weakness in the enemy line, punch through it, drive deep, cut supply lines, collapse the enemy's ability to think before they can react. They had proved it in Poland, for weeks to destroy the second largest army in Europe, in France, 6 weeks to defeat the army many considered the world's finest, at the gates of Moscow, in the deserts of North Africa, across the steppes of Russia. They were very, very good at this, and their tanks reflected it. The Panther entered service in 1943 as a direct response to the shock of encountering Soviet T-34s on the Eastern Front. German designers studied the T-34's sloped armor, the way angles deflect shells rather than simply absorbing them, and produce something by any honest measure superior to anything the Allies possessed. 45 tons. Frontal armor over 3 inches thick, angled at 60 degrees, effectively doubling its resistance to incoming fire. A high-velocity 75mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank at combat ranges. Crews that had often been fighting since 1939. The Tiger was something else entirely. 57 tons of steel, armed with the legendary 88mm gun derived from the famous anti-aircraft weapon. Virtually impervious to frontal attack. A fortress on tracks. Against all of this, the Americans brought the Sherman. 33 tons. A 75mm gun designed for infantry support, not tank versus tank combat. Armor that standard German anti-tank weapons could penetrate at over 1,000 meters. A tall, boxy silhouette that made it easy to spot and hit. A fuel system that, when struck, ignited with spectacular violence, earning its German nickname, Tommy Cooker. The crews climbing into Shermans in 1943 had, in many cases, completed training only weeks before deployment. They had never heard incoming fire. They were going against men who had spent 4 years doing almost nothing else. The German conclusion seemed not just reasonable, but obvious. Superior weapons and experienced crews would defeat inferior weapons and green troops. History had proven this many times over. History had one more lesson to offer. March 23, 1943. 6 weeks after Kasserine. The same desert. The same Americans, or so the Germans thought. A new man had taken command of the Second Corps on March 6th. George Smith Patton Jr. had 17 days between taking command and the next major engagement. 17 days to transform a broken army. He imposed discipline with ferocity. Officers caught out of uniform were fined on the spot. Every soldier wore his helmet at all times. Patton drove the front lines daily, fixing problems and removing officers who could not perform. Most importantly, he forced coordination. Infantry, artillery, and armor had to work together, the way the Germans had been doing for a decade. Artillery observers forward, with the infantry in radio contact with the guns. Tanks protected by infantry. Every element understanding its role. The 10th Panzer Division committed 50 of its 57 available tanks in a dawn attack down the El Gitter Valley on March 23rd. This was the same division that had helped scatter the Americans at Kasserine. Their commanders expected another easy morning. What they found was a prepared kill zone. American engineers had seeded the valley floor with minefields. 8 German tanks stopped at the entrance, trapped. Behind the minefield, in concealed positions along the valley walls, waited the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion with their M3 gun motor carriages, half-tracks mounting 75mm guns. Mobile ambush platforms, designed specifically for this, a channelized enemy, the first shot, concealment. As the German tanks bunched trying to navigate the obstacles, the tank destroyers opened fire. Artillery observers, actually forward with the lead units called in coordinates. Within minutes, synchronized shells began falling from multiple directions simultaneously, with no warning. The Germans could not advance through the minefield. They could not retreat without exposing thin rear armor. They could not locate the enemy. The valley walls were indistinguishable rock and scrub. The dust and smoke from explosions turned the morning into chaos. When it was over, the 10th Panzer Division had lost more than 30 tanks. The 601st claimed 37 kills. It was the first time American forces had defeated an experienced German armored formation in open battle. Rommel, reading the after-action reports from his sickbed in Germany, was stunned. 6 weeks earlier, these men had fled his tanks. Now they were standing firm and destroying them with systematic precision. He acknowledged, privately, that American commanders had learned mobile warfare with remarkable speed. But El-Getter was not simply better tactics. It was the first visible symptom of something the Germans had not yet diagnosed, something more dangerous than improved leadership. The Americans were not just fighting better. They were learning faster, and they had built a system specifically designed for that purpose. Every army adapts. The question is how fast and how systematically. The German army adapted brilliantly at the tactical level, talented commanders improvising effective responses to specific problems. What it struggled to do was institutionalize those adaptations, to take what one sergeant had figured out and make it standard practice across the force within weeks. The Wehrmacht rewarded individual brilliance. The Americans built the system first. It rested on 4 interlocking pillars. The first was artillery, not simply guns, but a coordination system no other force in the war ever matched. The United States Army had perfected time-on-target fire to a devastating degree. Multiple batteries synchronized so that shells fired from different distances along different trajectories arrived at the target simultaneously. No warning salvo. No time to take cover. The first thing the enemy heard was the full weight of the barrage, all at once from nowhere. Forward observers embedded with frontline units carried radios tuned directly to artillery batteries. A call for fire at battalion level brought a response in 3 minutes. Divisional artillery arrived in 6. Corps-level mass fires, dozens of batteries, hundreds of guns, in 9 minutes. German artillery typically required 30 minutes or more. 4 to 10 times slower at every echelon. Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the elite Panzerlehr Division during Operation Cobra in July 1944, experienced this firsthand. He described the bombardment in terms borrowed from the First World War. Innumerable guns of American artillery poured drum fire into our field positions. That a veteran of his caliber reached for that vocabulary tells you everything about the scale of what the Americans had built. The second pillar was air power, specifically the integration between air and ground that American commanders developed through months of brutal trial and error. The partnership reached its fullest expression in the relationship between Patton's 3rd Army and Brigadier General Otto Wayland's 19th Tactical Air Command. This was not cooperation between separate services. It was a single fighting organism. Air liaison officers rode inside the lead tanks of armored columns, carrying radios tuned to circling P-47 Thunderbolts. When a column hit resistance, aircraft could be on the target within minutes. Pilots and tank crews developed personal relationships. They invented tactics that no manual had anticipated, because no manual had yet been written for what they were doing. German soldiers called the P-47 the Jabo, Jag Bomber, fighter bomber. They called the Normandy front the Jabostreck, the fighter bomber racetrack. Any vehicle on an open road could expect attack within minutes. Any column that moved in daylight was a target. Field Marshal von Kluge wrote directly to Hitler. In the face of the total enemy air superiority, we can adopt no tactics to compensate for the annihilating power of air except to retire from the battlefield. The Luftwaffe, ground down by the strategic bombing campaign and attritional air battles over Germany, had virtually nothing left for France. The skies belonged entirely to the Allies. The third pillar was adaptation, the ability to convert combat experience into doctrine with institutional speed. And nothing illustrated this better than what happened in the hedgerow country of Normandy. The bocage, ancient earthen embankments built over centuries by Norman farmers, averaging 4 feet in height with root systems extending 3 to 12 feet into the earth, topped with brush up to 15 feet tall, was a defender's paradise and an attacker's nightmare. The fields they enclosed were tiny, often barely 300 feet across. When a Sherman tried to climb a hedgerow, it exposed thin belly armor to any German anti-tank weapon waiting on the other side. The obvious gaps were pre-registered by German panzer teams in ambush. Every gap was a death trap. Allied advances slowed to roughly a mile per day. At that rate, the liberation of France would take years. The solution did not come from a general or an engineering laboratory. It came from Sergeant Curtis Groff Cullen II of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, a 30-year-old National Guardsman from New Jersey who, before the war, had worked as a sales promotion assistant for a liquor distributor. No engineering training, no special technical background, just a soldier who refused to accept that a problem was unsolvable. During a brainstorming session, a soldier from Tennessee named Robert suggested, half-jokingly, why not put saw teeth on the front of a tank and cut through the hedgerow instead of climbing over it? Most of the room laughed. Cullen didn't. He thought about what was available. His eyes went to the German beach obstacles still scattered across the Norman coast. Czech hedgehogs, X-shaped steel structures designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft. He collected several, cut them apart, and welded the resulting prongs to the bow of a Sherman tank. On July 14, 1944, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley watched the demonstration. The tank backed off, oriented toward a hedgerow, and accelerated. The prongs bit into the earth. The root system held for a moment, then tore loose. The tank drove through under a canopy of dirt, belly armor intact, gun pointing forward. Bradley ordered mass production immediately. Ordnance teams worked around the clock under camouflage netting. Within 11 days, by the launch of Operation Cobra on July 25th, approximately 500 of these rhinoceros devices had been manufactured. 3 out of every 5 Shermans in the First Army carried Cullen's invention. The German High Command had placed those beach obstacles to stop the invasion at the waterline. Now, they were enabling American tanks to break out of Normandy. The fourth pillar was logistics, so overwhelming that German commanders struggled to comprehend its scale. But that comes later. First, the hammer had to fall. Operation Cobra was the most violent expression of everything the American system had learned. Bradley concentrated the full weight of 7th Corps on a front barely 4 miles wide, just west of the ruined town of St. Lo. Instead of pushing everywhere and achieving nothing decisive, he would smash through at one point and drive through the breach before the Germans could react. But first, he would ensure there was no defense left to resist. The bombardment that opened Cobra on July 25th was unlike anything the Western Front had yet seen. 1,500 heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force dropped 3,300 tons of explosives. 600 medium bombers followed. Fighter bombers rained 60,000 incendiary bombs across 12 square kilometers, the largest carpet bombing in direct support of ground troops in the history of warfare. Wehrlein's Panzer Lehr Division sat in the center of the impact zone. His account is one of the most harrowing primary sources from the entire conflict. The bombers came as if on a conveyor belt. Back and forth the carpets were laid. Artillery positions were wiped out, tanks overturned and buried, infantry positions flattened. Several of my men went mad and rushed round in the open until they were cut down by splinters. When von Kluge demanded that Wehrlein hold the line, the Panzer commander replied, "Out in front, everyone is holding out. Everyone, my grenadiers and my engineers and my tank crews. They're all holding their ground. Not a single man is leaving his post. They're lying silent in their foxholes because they are dead." Over 70% of Panzer Lehr soldiers were killed, wounded, or incapacitated before a single American ground soldier crossed the start line. One of the most elite armored divisions in the German armed forces had ceased to exist as a fighting force before the battle properly began. The rhinoceros-equipped Shermans tore through the hedgerows. German defensive positions, prepared for the obvious approach routes through the gaps, found themselves outflanked by tanks driving through the walls of the fields. The breakthrough materialized within hours of the ground assault stepping off. The exploitation that followed shocked even optimistic American planners. By July 28th, the 4th Armored Division had seized Coutances. By July 31st, it had captured Avranches, 35 miles in 6 days, with 20,000 prisoners. Patton took command of the 3rd Army on August 1st and turned the breach into a flood that would not stop until it reached the German border. The German counterattack at Mortain on August 7th. 4 Panzer divisions, 145 tanks, Hitler's personal order to drive to the sea, was stopped cold by combined arms defense and air attack. American infantry held the heights, while fighter-bombers hunted German armor in the open below. Within days, the Germans were not counterattacking. They were fleeing. The Falaise pocket closed around them. Over 50,000 were captured. Tens of thousands more died. Germany committed approximately 2,300 tanks and assault guns to the Normandy campaign. 100 to 120 escaped across the Seine River. The rest were destroyed, abandoned, or captured. The army that had conquered Europe in 6 weeks had, in 10 weeks of fighting in France, been shattered beyond reconstruction. The most complete demonstration of what the American system had become came 2 months after Cobra, in a place called Arracourt. It is taught at West Point as a masterclass in mobile defense, the definitive case study in how American tactics defeated technically superior German armor through superior training, terrain awareness, and combined arms coordination. After Patton's Third Army raced 300 miles across France, fuel shortages halted the advance on September 1st. The logistical system that had sustained one of the most rapid advances in military history simply could not keep pace. Tanks sat idle in fields across Lorraine, waiting for gasoline. Germany seized the pause. General Otto von Manschuffel's 5th Panzer Army gathered 262 tanks and assault guns, including brand-new Panthers from the 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades. On paper, a force capable of crushing the outnumbered Americans who had outrun their supply lines. In reality, it was fatally flawed. The Panzer Brigades were new formations, assembled in haste to meet the crisis. Their crews had received 2 weeks of training. 2 weeks. Many could not read maps accurately. They had never operated together as units. They had no organic artillery support, no reconnaissance elements. They had never fought a battle. They were driving brand-new Panther tanks into men who had been fighting and winning since Normandy. Opposing them was Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division, under Colonel Bruce Clark. Fewer than 100 tanks, outnumbered nearly 3 to 1. But Clark's men had spent the weeks of the fuel shortage learning the ground, scouting every ridge and hollow, identifying fields of fire, marking the approaches an attacker would have to use. They dug their tanks into hold-down positions. They coordinated with artillery. They waited. The battle opened on September 19th in heavy fog and rain. The fog that gave the Germans a measure of surprise also negated the Panther's greatest advantage. At 2,000 meters in clear weather, a Panther was essentially unkillable by a Sherman. At close range and fog, crew skill mattered far more than gun caliber. And the Americans had been building crew skill for months. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams commanded the 37th Tank Battalion at the center of the defense. His tactics were a masterclass in applied doctrine: fire and maneuver, hold down positions, flank shots over frontal engagement, every engagement coordinated with infantry and artillery, so that no German tank could advance without facing simultaneous threats from multiple directions. When Panthers appeared through the murk, American crews were already waiting, guns trained on likely approach routes. The Germans searched for targets while moving through unfamiliar terrain. The Americans merely had to acquire and fire. In tank combat, the side that fires first almost always wins. At Arracourt, the Americans fired first, again and again and again. The M18 Hellcat tank destroyer embodied a philosophy that was the opposite of German armored thinking. Where Germany built ever heavier tanks with ever thicker armor, the Americans built 18 tons of thin-skinned speed. The Hellcat could reach 55 miles per hour on roads. Its armor was light enough that heavy machine gun fire could penetrate it at close range. It was not designed to survive being hit. It was designed to avoid being hit. The doctrine was simple: never trade blows with a Panther. Use superior speed to reach a position where you could put a round through the Panther's thinner side or rear armor, then move before the enemy could respond. A single platoon of 4 M18 Hellcats, under Lieutenant Edwin Leeper of Charlie Company, 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, executed an ambush that would become a textbook example. Leeper positioned his 4 vehicles behind a low ridge overlooking the primary German approach. When Panthers appeared through the murk, he waited for optimal close range and opened fire. The German commanders had no idea where the shots were coming from. By the time they organized any response, Leaper's Hellcats had fired, repositioned, and fired again. 4 American vehicles destroyed, approximately 15 German tanks. 3 Hellcats were lost. The 4th withdrew intact. On September 20th, one of the war's most improbable figures entered the battle above the fog. Major Charles Carpenter was an artillery observation pilot flying a Piper L-4 Grasshopper, a fabric-covered aircraft weighing less than 1,000 pounds, with a top speed of 85 miles per hour. A toy, by any conventional measure. Carpenter had modified his L-4, which he called Rosie the Rocketeer, by strapping 6 bazooka tubes to the wing struts. When he spotted Panthers advancing below, he dove and fired. German tank commanders were accustomed to threats from the ground and to serious aircraft from the air. They were not prepared to be attacked by something that resembled a recreational plane made of canvas and wire. Over his combat career at Arracourt, Carpenter was credited with 6 tank kills, making him, in all probability, the only pilot in history to become an armored vehicle ace in a fabric-covered observation aircraft. When September ended, Manchufeld's 5th Panzer Army had been shattered. Of 262 tanks and assault guns committed to the offensive, only 62 remained operational. 86 were completely destroyed. 114 were damaged, broken down, and abandoned. The brand-new Panzer brigades, assembled at such cost and rushed to the front, had been annihilated in their first engagement. Combat Command lost 25 Shermans and 7 tank destroyers. The exchange ratio approached 3-to-1 in America's favor. A post-war study by the Army's Ballistic Research Laboratory examined 30 armor-on-armor engagements involving the 3rd and 4th Armored Divisions. It found that the Sherman achieved a 3.6-to-1 kill ratio against the Panther. Not because the Sherman was a better tank, it was not, in any measurable technical sense. But the 4th Armored Division was a better fighting force. Experienced crews, sound tactics, seamless combined arms integration, and commanders who understood that the first shot almost always decided the engagement, regardless of whose armor was thicker. History tends to remember the weapons and forget the men. But the story of how America won the tank war is inseparable from the individuals who drove, commanded, and died in those vehicles. Creighton Abrams, lieutenant colonel at Arracourt, later one of the most decorated officers of the war, was the finest American tank battalion commander of the conflict. His 37th Tank Battalion saw more tank versus tank combat than nearly any other American unit. He went through 7 tanks during the war, all named Thunderbolt. He led from the front, always in the lead vehicle, always where the fighting was thickest. Patton himself declared, "I am supposed to be the best tank commander in the Army, but I have one peer, Abe Abrams. He is the world champion." After the war, Abrams rose to become Army Chief of Staff. The M1 Abrams main battle tank, the most lethal armored vehicle in the world today, bears his name. Staff Sergeant Lafayette Poole of the 3rd Armored Division was America's tank ace. In 81 days of combat between June 27th and September 15th, 1944, Poole destroyed 12 tanks and 258 other vehicles. He commanded 3 successive Shermans, all named in the mood after the Glenn Miller song. He kept the same 4-man crew throughout, a choice that speaks to something critical. Crew cohesion, the ability to function as a single organism under fire, mattered enormously. Poole's crew knew each other's instincts before they happened. Poole's war ended on September 15th when a Panther shell took his right leg 8 inches above the knee. He survived. The character of Sergeant Wardaddy in the 2014 film Fury was reportedly inspired in part by his story. Major General Maurice Rose commanded the 3rd Armored Division, the spearhead, and embodied everything the American system could produce. The son of a rabbi from Denver, he had enlisted as a private in 1916 and risen entirely on merit. He was the highest-ranking Jewish officer in the United States Army. Under his aggressive frontline leadership, the 3rd Armored was the first American armored unit to enter Germany, the first to breach the Siegfried Line, the first to enter Cologne. Rose led from the front, often in an open jeep ahead of his own tanks, because he believed commanders had to feel the situation in real time. On March 30th, 1945, near Paderborn, With Germany's defeat weeks away, his jeep was surrounded by German tanks from SS Brigade Westphalen. As Rose apparently reached toward his holster, a tank crew member shot him with a machine pistol. He was 45 years old, the highest-ranking American officer killed by enemy fire in the European theater. Major General John Wood trained and led the 4th Armored Division. Basil Liddell Hart, Britain's foremost military theorist, spent 2 days interviewing Wood after the war and called him the Rommel of the American armored forces. Wood's emphasis was always speed and shock. Strike deep, bypass resistance, force the enemy to react rather than act. The results speak for themselves. The 4th Armored Division took 90,000 prisoners, destroyed 579 German tanks, and earned 9 unit citations for extraordinary heroism. These men were not born soldiers. They were ordinary Americans made extraordinary by experience, leadership, and a system that rewarded learning over tradition. Individual heroism can explain individual battles. Explaining a campaign requires looking at the numbers, and the numbers behind the American war effort were unlike anything military history had previously recorded. The United States produced 49,324 M4 Sherman tanks during the war. Germany produced approximately 6,000 Panthers, 1,350 Tiger Is, and 492 Tiger IIs. The ratio exceeded 6-to-1 in medium and heavy tanks. At peak production, American factories built more than 2,000 Shermans per month. Germany's Panther production peaked at 380 per month in July 1944. Tiger production never exceeded 104 per month. But the raw numbers only begin to tell it. The real American advantage was not just building more tanks. It was keeping them running. The Sherman was designed from the outset for mass maintenance. Engineers at the Detroit Arsenal made a deliberate choice. Sacrifice cutting-edge performance for reliability and ease of repair. Every major component was accessible with standard tools. An entire engine could be swapped in the field within hours by ordinary mechanics. The transmission could be replaced without specialized equipment. Changing a Panther's transmission required specialized equipment and could take days. The final drive, the mechanism transferring engine power to the tracks, was a chronic weakness based on a pre-war design never intended for a 45-ton vehicle. Roughly 5% of Panthers broke down within 100 kilometers of road travel. 90% failed within 1,500 kilometers. Neither Tigers nor Panthers could travel appreciable distances under their own power without mechanical breakdown. They required rail transport. Tigers were too wide, even for standard German rail cars, without removing combat tracks and fitting narrower transport versions. German divisions routinely operated below 50% of authorized armored strength, not because of combat losses, but because of mechanical failures and inability to recover damaged vehicles. The American answer was the 5-echelon maintenance system. Tank crews performed daily maintenance themselves. Company mechanics handled more complex work. Battalion-level shops addressed harder problems. Division ordnance companies carried mobile machine shops capable of fabricating replacement parts in the field. Base overhaul facilities could rebuild vehicles from the ground up. A Sherman knocked out on Monday might be back in action by Friday. A Panther knocked out on Monday might sit abandoned for lack of recovery vehicles and spare parts. The 3rd Armored Division's experience illustrates the power of this system. It entered Normandy with 232 Shermans. During the campaign, it lost 648 tanks, completely destroyed. Another 700 were knocked out, repaired, and returned to service, a 580% replacement cycle that kept the division at fighting strength throughout the war. German commanders watching American units absorb losses that would have broken a Panzer division and keep fighting could not understand how it was possible. They were accustomed to armies that collapsed when tank strength dropped below certain thresholds. The Americans seemed immune to attrition. Behind all of this stood the Red Ball Express, the famous truck convoy route from Normandy to the front, moving over 12,500 tons of supplies daily at its peak, more than 6,000 trucks running continuously around the clock. When fuel shortages finally halted Patton's advance in September 1944, it was not because the system failed. It was because the advance had been so rapid that even this massive effort could not keep pace. Germany had no equivalent. They had never needed one. They had won with quality and tactical brilliance. They were losing to quantity and systematic competence. December 16th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest. 5:30 in the morning. 250,000 German soldiers, with over 1,400 tanks and assault guns, crossed the Allied line along an 80-mile front. The largest German offensive in the West since 1940. Hitler's goal? Drive to Antwerp, split the Allied armies, force a negotiated peace before the Soviet steamroller from the east made negotiation impossible. His last gamble, and he was right about the last part. The attack came in fog and snow that grounded the Allied air forces. In the first days, whole divisions were overrun. The 106th Infantry Division lost 2 full regiments, nearly 8,000 men, in the greatest single American military defeat since the Philippines. The shock was real, but what followed was the supreme test of everything the American Army had built since Kasserine. At St. Vith, Brigadier General Bruce Clark, the same officer who had commanded Combat Command A at Arracourt 3 months earlier, held a vital road junction against an entire German corps for 6 critical days. The German timetable had allocated 1 day to capture St. Vith. Clark's men denied them that junction for 6 times as long, buying time that no amount of German planning could recover. At Celis, the 2nd Armored Division encircled and annihilated the spearhead of the German 2nd Panzer Division just 4 miles from the Meuse River, the furthest point the offensive would ever reach. The German tanks had advanced so far so fast that they'd outrun their fuel supply. They sat motionless on Belgian roads, waiting for gasoline that would never arrive. American armor closed around them and destroyed them where they stood. But the signature achievement of the battle, perhaps of the entire Western War, was Patton's relief of Bastogne. The key crossroads town had been surrounded on December 20th. The 101st Airborne Division and elements of the 10th Armored held out against overwhelming odds, undersupplied, in temperatures well below zero. When the German commander sent a formal surrender demand, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe sent back a single typed word: nuts. But defiance alone would not save the garrison. It needed relief. Patton had been preparing since mid-November. His intelligence officer, Colonel Oscar Koch, had detected signs of the German buildup in the Ardennes weeks before the attack, an achievement that eluded the rest of the Allied intelligence apparatus. Patton had ordered contingency plans, nickel, dime, and cent. Each detailed how the Third Army could disengage from its current operations, pivot 90 degrees north, and attack into the German flank. At a crisis conference in Verdun on December 19th, Eisenhower asked Patton when he could attack. Patton said 48 hours. The room went silent. No army had ever executed a 90-degree turn of that scale, in that weather, at that speed. Before the meeting ended, Patton had already phoned his headquarters. 2 words: play ball. More than 133,000 vehicles reoriented on icy roads in blizzard conditions. Over 62,000 tons of supplies shifted. 4,500 tons of ammunition moved daily. The 4th Armored Division marched 150 miles in 19 hours. Men drove without sleep through snow and darkness. Tanks broke down and were pushed to the roadside. The column kept moving. On December 26th, Abrams had 20 operational tanks remaining. His men were exhausted, fighting through German resistance in weather that made the Norman hedgerows seem temperate. Bastogne was ahead. "We are going into those people now," he told his crew. "Let her roll." First Lieutenant Charles Boggess, commanding an M4A3E2 jumbo Sherman named Cobra King, drove toward the Bastogne perimeter through the village of Assinois under cover of 2,340 artillery shells from 13 batteries, fired in 8 minutes. The barrage left German defenders stunned and disoriented. At 4:50 in the afternoon, Boggess reached the perimeter. The first American he encountered was 2nd Lieutenant Dwayne Webster of the 326th Airborne Infantry Engineer Battalion. "How are you?" Boggess asked. "Glad to see you," Webster said. The siege was over. Cobra King was preserved. It sits today at the National Museum of the United States Army at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. Olive drab paint, gun pointed slightly upward. It does not look like a symbol of anything. It looks like a tank that has been through a war, which is exactly what it is. After the war, German generals were interrogated at length by American military historians. Their memoirs, as scholars Ronald Smelser and Edward Davies have noted, were systematically exculpatory, attributing German defeat to Hitler's interference and Allied material superiority while minimizing Allied tactical excellence. That caveat made, their tactical assessments are revealing precisely because they are offered with evident reluctance. Heinz Guderian, the father of German armor doctrine, the intellectual architect of the panzer forces that had conquered Poland and France, told his American interrogators in 1945, "From the standpoint of a tank specialist, I must congratulate him on his victory since he acted as I would have done had I been in his place." The man who invented the doctrine, acknowledging the student had mastered it. Gunther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff of OB West, was more expansive. "We regarded General Patton extremely highly as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies. He even improved on Napoleon's basic tenet: activite, vitesse, vitesse, activity, speed, speed." What shocked German panzer crews was not the Sherman's armor or its gun. Both were inferior to what the Panthers and Tigers fielded. What shocked them was the system surrounding the Sherman. Artillery in 3 minutes rather than 30. Fighter bombers overhead within a radio call. Maintenance crews returning knocked-out tanks to service within days. A production line building 6 Shermans for every Panther Germany could assemble. The Ballistic Research Laboratory's finding, a 3.6 to 1 kill ratio for the Sherman against the Panther in actual combat, tells the complete story. First shot advantage mattered more than armor thickness. Crew training mattered more than gun caliber. Coordination mattered more than muzzle velocity. From Sergeant Kuhlen's hedgerow cutter, fashioned from enemy beach obstacles by a liquor salesman who refused to accept an unsolvable problem, to Patton's 133,000 vehicle pivot in a Belgian blizzard. From a disaster at Kasserine in February 1943 to the annihilation of elite panzer brigades at Arracourt in September 1944. 18 months. Same equipment. Same training pipeline. Radically different results. The difference was not technology. The Sherman did not become a better tank between Tunisia and France. What changed was everything surrounding it. The tactics, the coordination, the institutional mechanisms that converted combat experience into doctrine and distributed that doctrine across an entire army within weeks. The Wehrmacht built better weapons. The Americans built a learning machine. And in the end, the learning machine won. The men who built it were not special. They were ordinary. Farm boys from Iowa. Factory workers from Detroit. A liquor salesman from New Jersey who welded scrap steel to a tank's nose because he couldn't stop thinking about a problem nobody else thought was solvable. The Germans had expected amateurs. By 1945, Guderian was offering congratulations. The Wehrmacht had the better tanks. The Americans had the better system. The system always wins.